So today I want to talk about the somewhat counterintuitive idea that accepting our suffering is necessary for developing compassion instead of fighting it or resisting it like I think most of us do almost instinctively. So accepting our suffering, or dare I say embracing our suffering, is what allows us to respond to pain with wisdom and compassion rather than ignorance and anger. And this kind of response prevents us from creating the causes for future suffering, while the present suffering is given space to go away on its own. So my thoughts are inspired by the book No Mud, No Lotus by Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. And Venerable Sangye Kadro had mentioned this book in a recent teaching she gave on thought training techniques. And these thought transformation techniques are called lojong in Tibetan, and they involve taking painful or difficult experiences in our life and using them to increase our patience, compassion, and other spiritual aspirations. So we can do this either by changing our thoughts or by changing our actions. And Thich Nhat Hanh recommends in his book the two practices of mindfulness and loving kindness to help us transform our suffering into joy and happiness. Similar to a book title, also that you may be familiar with. So with mindfulness and loving kindness, we acknowledge that we are experiencing pain. We turn our undivided attention towards it, which is often quite difficult, and then we learn to embrace it with a loving attitude. And as a result, whatever mental suffering we're experiencing on top of the pain, the initial pain, will decrease. And we can begin to interpret the situation from a more positive point of view. So those of us who've been practicing Buddhism for some time have probably heard this teaching before. But very recently, I had an experience that really made just how clear I instinctively resist and fight painful emotions, and how learning to sit with them with an open and non-judgmental mind can transform them into peace, clarity, and contentment. So the Abbey has been in quarantine all year due to the coronavirus, and I've actually found it quite difficult not to be able to go to any of the local teachings that the monastics usually give, or to head into town to run errands or visit the doctors. And the Abbey's also closed to guests who usually bring a lot of enthusiasm and inspiration with them when they visit. So I know it's probably much more difficult for people who are quarantined at home and they don't have a community to interact with or a lot of open space to walk around. But I've actually found myself struggling with a lot of restlessness coming up in my mind in the past few months, and it's been difficult to find out the root. So at the Abbey, we are also fortunate to have all of our external needs met, like food, shelter, clothing, medicine, and even companionship. So at least I could tell that the cause of the disturbance must be in my mind. So the other day, and just a couple days ago, a very strong feeling of being trapped suddenly took over my mind, and I felt that I needed to run away as far as possible. And the strength of the emotion caught me by surprise because I had a fairly smooth and productive day. So seemingly out of nowhere, this extreme sense of discontent came up that I found almost unbearable. And this happened right before evening meditation. So for the next hour, I was able to directly witness and hold the agitated and distressed feelings that kept arising in my mind. And the emotions were so strong that I had no energy to analyze them intellectually. Instead, I had to just sit there and be present with them as much as I could. And I'll say that the experience was actually quite excruciating because everything inside me told me to run and distract and forget. But as I sat there motionless and gave full attention to the emotions, I could begin to feel energy moving deeply within my body. I instinctively knew that a kind of healing was starting to take place and that my mind was purifying itself of negative energy that had been left from harmful actions I'd done in the past. It seemed like my mind was trying to rewire itself and letting go of the unrealistic expectations and ideas I had about how to find happiness in samsara. And as I let the energy pass through, a profound sense of release and even bliss emerged. And I realized that spiritual experiences or breakthroughs are often preceded by a lot of pain and confusion. One of my friends had given me a book shortly before I came to the Abbey about how depression can be interpreted as a reminder to return to a more honest version of ourselves and a simpler way of living. And I got a similar sense that the stress I was experiencing was a sign that I had strayed too far from my inner goodness and had gotten wrapped up in unnecessary complications, arrogance, and greed. This experience of just sitting with my painful emotions rather than jumping immediately into applying an antidote also showed me why humility is such an important part of the spiritual path. The pain arising in my mind felt like it was knocking me off a high ladder that had put me out of touch with the earth and all the other living beings below. And I understood directly how love and compassion can only grow in the soil of humility and the tenderness and innocence required for true happiness. The minute I got involved in conceptualizations or interpretations of my experience, the pain would get worse. But when I would surrender to the present moment and approach it like a child on her first day of kindergarten, the pain would turn into what felt like a profound spiritual gift. Well, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said that when he attained an indirect realization of emptiness, it felt like a lightning bolt struck his chest, and he was in pain for the next several days. And I've also heard the Thai forest monk Ajahn Chah describe the tremendous pain that he felt throughout his body when he gained a certain realization. And we all know the image of Jesus dying on the cross as a sign of his deep love and compassion for all human beings. So all of this says to me that without some degree of suffering, there can be no compassion, no wisdom, and no spiritual growth. And Thich Nhat Hanh explains this very clearly in the book No Mud, No Lotus, where he says, being able to enjoy happiness doesn't require that we have zero suffering. In fact, the art of happiness is also the art of suffering well. When there is no suffering, there can be no happiness either, and vice versa. When we learn to acknowledge, embrace, and understand our suffering, we suffer much less. Not only that, but we're able to go further and transform our suffering into understanding, compassion, and joy for ourselves and for others. And the Buddha's first teaching after enlightenment was the truth of suffering, its origins, cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. Thus, wholeheartedly accepting our suffering without trying to change it is a gateway to freedom. Of course, we don't stop there, but we need a gentle and accepting state of mind in order to find the root of our suffering, which is the idea that there is actually such a thing as a self that can suffer. Suffering does not mean that we are bad or wrong, that we are lousy practitioners deserving of punishment. Rather, suffering is the nourishing mud we need to grow our lotus of wisdom and compassion. And I think it'd be really difficult to follow any spiritual path without learning to recognize, embrace, and transform our suffering, and then share that knowledge with others. The thought training techniques actually encourage us to rejoice when we encounter suffering, because suffering is the only thing that enables us to develop fortitude, compassion, and understanding that allows us to become Buddhas. We may not be quite there yet, but at least we can try to accept suffering when it arises and listen to the very important information that it has to share. So if you happen to experience suffering today or any time in the future, may we try to stop and give our full attention to it rather than mindlessly pushing it away or numbing out, and extend loving kindness and compassion, recognizing that all suffering has a profound spiritual lesson to teach us. And Thich Nhat Hanh described how this will allow our mind to relax, and insight will naturally arise regarding the impermanence of all suffering, and maybe how we could adapt our thoughts and behaviors in the future to avoid future suffering. And of course, as we learn to reduce our own suffering, we'll have much more space in our minds to be able to reach out to others as well, who are suffering, if not as much as we are, even more.